What would you do if police dragged an old veteran off a city bus in front of everyone, only to realize moments later that the entire station knew his name? Before we begin, comment your city and what time it is right now, because this story starts with humiliation, but it ends with something so powerful, the entire station falls silent. It happened on a cold, rainy evening in downtown Chicago. Rush hour traffic, packed buses, tired passengers trying to get home after work. And when an elderly black man quietly stepped onto the city bus wearing an old military jacket, nobody imagined police officers would throw him out in front of everyone. Especially not the young officers who thought he was just another old man causing trouble. Rain tapped softly against the city streets, while headlights reflected across wet pavement beneath the glow of downtown traffic lights. The city bus rumbled slowly through crowded evening traffic, packed with exhausted passengers heading home after long workdays. Inside the bus, yellow overhead lights flickered gently, while people sat quietly scrolling through phones, staring out rain-covered windows, or resting their heads against cold glass as the vehicle stopped every few blocks to pick up more riders. Near the back sat construction workers in dirty boots, while several students quietly listened to music through headphones. Up front, an irritated businessman repeatedly checked his expensive watch while muttering under his breath about traffic delays. The atmosphere carried that heavy silence familiar to every crowded city bus at the end of a long day. Then, the bus stopped near an older part of downtown, beside a nearly empty station platform. The doors hissed open slowly. An elderly black man stepped aboard, carrying a worn duffel bag over one shoulder.
He looked somewhere in his 70s now, tall but slower with age, wearing an old dark military jacket decorated with faded patches and medals barely visible beneath the rainwater on the fabric. His gray beard looked neatly trimmed, and despite the exhaustion in his face, there was still something steady about the way he carried himself. Quiet dignity. The driver glanced toward him impatiently. "Fare?" The old man reached slowly into his coat pocket, searching for coins, while several passengers near the front watched with annoyance already growing on their faces. His hands trembled slightly from age as he counted the change carefully. "Come on, man," the businessman near the front muttered loudly. "Some of us are trying to get home tonight." The old veteran continued counting calmly, despite the pressure building around him. Rainwater dripped from the edge of his jacket onto the bus floor, while the driver sighed heavily behind the wheel. Finally, the old man looked up quietly. "I'm short 50 cents, he admitted softly. The driver immediately shook his head. "Then you can't ride." Several passengers nearby looked away awkwardly, while others stared openly. The veteran glanced toward the empty seats farther down the bus before looking back at the driver. "It's freezing outside," he said quietly. "I just need to get to the station." The driver crossed his arms impatiently. "Rules are rules." The old man lowered his eyes briefly. Around the bus, the silence grew heavier as people watched the scene unfold without saying anything. And standing there beneath the flickering bus lights, soaked from rain and carrying a faded military bag, the old veteran looked less like a threat and more like someone the world had simply stopped noticing. The bus remained stopped beside the station platform, while rain continued hitting the windows outside.
Passengers shifted impatiently in their seats as the elderly veteran stood near the fare box, holding the small handful of coins in his trembling hand. The driver rubbed his forehead with visible frustration. "Sir, I already told you, no fare, no ride." The veteran nodded slowly, clearly hearing the irritation in the man's voice. "I understand," he replied calmly. "I'm only trying to get to Central Station."
The businessman near the front let out an annoyed breath. "This is ridiculous," he muttered loudly enough for half the bus to hear. "Why are we all waiting because someone can't pay 50 cents? A few passengers quietly nodded, while others avoided looking at the old man altogether. The veteran slowly reached into his duffel bag again, like he hoped he might find additional change hidden somewhere inside. The driver shook his head impatiently. "Sir, either pay the fare or step off the bus." The old man paused for several seconds before quietly asking, "Could I pay when I reach the station?" The driver laughed once under his breath. "That's not how this works." Several younger passengers near the middle of the bus started recording quietly on their phones now, sensing tension building. The veteran looked around the bus briefly. Nobody offered to help. Nobody offered the extra 50 cents. People simply watched him standing there soaked from rain, while the driver treated him like an inconvenience, delaying everyone's evening. Finally, the businessman stood slightly from his seat. "Just call transit police already," he snapped. "We don't have all night." The sentence changed the atmosphere instantly. The old veteran slowly lifted his eyes toward the man, but said nothing. The driver hesitated briefly before grabbing the radio beside his seat. "Transit security, I've got a fare refusal situation at Madison and Clark." Nearby passengers immediately straightened in their seats after hearing that. Some looked uncomfortable now. Others simply looked curious to see what would happen next. The veteran remained calm somehow through all of it, quietly tightening his grip on the worn duffel bag hanging from his shoulder, while rain continued falling outside beneath the flashing station lights. Minutes later, flashing transit police lights reflected through the rain-covered windows as two young officers stepped onto the bus from the station platform outside. Their dark uniforms dripped slightly from the weather, while passengers immediately turned toward the front to watch. The driver pointed directly toward the old veteran standing quietly beside the fare box. "That's him." The first officer looked the veteran up and down briefly before speaking. "Sir, we're going to need you to step off the bus." The veteran nodded calmly. "Officer, I'm only short 50 cents. I was trying to get to Central Station." The second officer crossed his arms. "You were asked to leave already." Nearby passengers watched silently, while phones continued recording from different seats. The old veteran slowly looked around the crowded bus one more time before quietly saying, "I served this city for 40 years. The businessman near the front scoffed loudly. "And now you're holding up the whole route." The humiliation became public immediately. Several passengers looked uncomfortable now, especially after hearing the old man's voice shake slightly from exhaustion rather than anger. But nobody stepped in. Nobody defended him. The first officer stepped closer. "Sir, please don't make this difficult." The veteran slowly picked up his duffel bag fully onto his shoulder. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," he said softly. But the second officer had already lost patience. He grabbed the old man firmly by the arm. "Off the bus, now." Gasps spread quietly through several rows as passengers watched the elderly veteran struggle slightly to maintain balance while being pulled toward the exit. The medals on his old military jacket caught the overhead light briefly as the officers escorted him down the bus steps into the cold rain outside. And, standing there, beneath flashing transit lights, while strangers watched from warm seats inside the bus, the old veteran looked completely alone. Rain poured harder now across the station platform while the officers continued escorting the elderly veteran toward the transit station entrance. The wet pavement reflected flashing police lights beneath the dark evening sky, while commuters nearby slowed down to watch the scene unfold. The old man struggled slightly with his balance as one officer kept a firm grip on his arm. "Careful," the veteran muttered quietly. "My knee isn't what it used to be." But the younger officer barely listened.
Maybe you should have thought about that before refusing to pay." The old man stopped walking for a second and looked at him calmly despite the rain dripping down his face. "I wasn't refusing," he said softly. "I was asking for help." The sentence hung heavily in the cold air. Nearby commuters exchanged uncomfortable looks, while several people near the station entrance quietly watched from beneath umbrellas. One older woman near the ticket machines shook her head in disbelief after noticing the medals pinned to the veteran's jacket. The first officer finally glanced down at them too. Bronze stars, service ribbons, military insignia faded with age. "You were in the Army?" he asked casually. The veteran nodded once. "Marine Corps." The second officer shrugged dismissively. "Doesn't change the law." The old man lowered his eyes briefly while rainwater rolled down the fabric of his jacket. Then, quietly, almost to himself, he said, "Funny thing is, I used to protect this station." The officers exchanged confused looks, but before either could respond, the doors to Central Station suddenly opened behind them.
And the moment several transit workers inside saw the old veteran standing in the rain surrounded by police officers, everything changed. The moment the station doors opened, warm yellow light spilled out across the rain-covered platform, while several transit employees stepped outside carrying paperwork and coffee cups after finishing shift changes inside the terminal. At first, none of them paid much attention to the scene near the station entrance. Police officers dealing with passengers wasn't unusual in the city. But then, one older station supervisor suddenly froze mid-step after looking toward the elderly veteran standing in the rain. His eyes widened instantly. "Wait," he whispered under his breath. He stepped forward slowly, staring harder through the rain, like his mind was struggling to believe what he was seeing. Then suddenly, his face changed completely. "Captain?" The entire platform seemed to pause. The two officers looked confused immediately, while the old veteran slowly lifted his eyes toward the station supervisor. Nearby commuters glanced between them uncertainly. "Captain Howard," the supervisor repeated louder now, visibly shocked. The veteran gave a small, tired nod. "Evening, Frank." The station supervisor looked horrified after noticing the officer still gripping the old man's arm. "What are you doing?" he demanded sharply. The younger officer frowned. "Sir, this man refused to pay bus fare." "This man?" Frank repeated in disbelief. Rain continued pouring around them, while more station employees gathered near the doorway, trying to understand what was happening. Frank stepped closer toward the veteran immediately. "Captain Howard built security operations for this entire station system," he said. Silence. The officers stared at him blankly. Frank pointed toward the old veteran's jacket. "This man served in the Marines before protecting this city for over 40 years. Nearby commuters visibly reacted after hearing that.
One woman near the ticket machines covered her mouth slightly, while several passengers who had stepped off the bus looked back toward the platform in shock. The younger officer slowly released the veteran's arm now, uncertainty replacing authority across his face. But Frank wasn't finished. He looked toward the station entrance and raised his voice sharply. "Somebody call the platform team down here, right now!" The veteran remained calm through all of it, rain still dripping from his old military jacket, while the station around him suddenly transformed completely. And standing beneath flashing transit lights, the same man people ignored moments earlier was no longer being treated like a burden. Now, people were starting to remember exactly who he was. Within less than a minute, the atmosphere around Central Station changed completely. Transit workers began appearing from different entrances and lower platforms after hearing Captain Howard's name over the radios inside the station.
Some stopped abruptly the moment they recognized the elderly veteran standing in the rain beside the police officers. Others immediately straightened their posture almost instinctively. The two young officers looked completely lost now, glancing between the growing crowd of station workers and the old man they had just dragged off the bus like a criminal. "Wait, that's Captain Howard?" one younger transit employee whispered in disbelief. Another worker nodded quickly. "He trained half the security staff in this city." The veteran lowered his eyes quietly while the rain continued soaking through his old military jacket. He clearly wasn't enjoying the attention. Frank stepped beside him protectively now, visibly angry. "Do you officers have any idea who you just humiliated in front of this station?" The first officer swallowed hard. "Sir, we didn't know." Frank looked at him sharply. "Exactly." The sentence landed hard in the cold air, because suddenly everyone understood the real problem.
Nobody asked questions. Nobody cared who the old man was before judging him. They saw an elderly black veteran short 50 cents on bus fare and immediately treated him like a problem. More station workers slowly gathered nearby now. Several older employees looked genuinely emotional after recognizing Captain Howard standing there soaked from rain, while strangers stared at him. One gray-haired transit mechanic quietly removed his hat and stepped closer. "Captain," he said softly. "Good to see you again, sir." The old veteran gave him a tired smile. Nearby commuters who witnessed the scene earlier now looked visibly uncomfortable. The businessman from the bus stood near the platform entrance, frozen with embarrassment, after realizing the old man he mocked moments earlier was respected by the entire station. Then, suddenly, one of the older transit officers standing near the station doors straightened fully and raised his hand in salute toward Captain Howard. Silence spread instantly. Another transit worker followed, then another. Within seconds, nearly the entire station staff standing outside Central Station slowly raised their hands in respect toward the elderly veteran standing alone in the rain. The platform fell completely silent, except for the sound of rainfall hitting the pavement. The two young police officers stared in shock, while the veteran looked around quietly at the people saluting him. Not with pride, not arrogance, just sadness. Because respect only arrived after people learned his name. The station platform remained completely silent while dozens of transit workers stood saluting Captain Howard beneath the cold rain. Nearby commuters, who earlier ignored the humiliation, now looked deeply uncomfortable watching the scene unfold. Some lowered their eyes completely, while others quietly slipped phones back into their pockets after recording the confrontation. The two young officers stood frozen beside the platform entrance, their earlier confidence completely gone. The younger one looked physically sick with embarrassment now after realizing he grabbed and dragged a decorated veteran respected by the entire station system. Frank slowly lowered his salute and looked directly at the officers. This man missed birthdays, holidays, and decades with his family, protecting people in this city, he said sharply. And tonight, you treated him like he didn't matter over 50 cents. The words hit hard across the platform. Captain Howard calmly adjusted the strap of his old duffel bag while rainwater continued dripping from the metals on his jacket. He still hadn't raised his voice once. That calmness somehow made the situation even more painful for everyone watching. The businessman from the bus finally stepped forward awkwardly. "Sir," he started quietly, but Captain Howard simply looked at him calmly before the man lost the courage to continue speaking, because there was nothing meaningful left to say anymore. The truth of the situation already stood exposed beneath the station lights for everyone to see.
Frank quickly removed his own station coat and placed it gently over Captain Howard's shoulders, while several transit workers gathered closer around him protectively. The atmosphere around the officers had completely changed now. Moments earlier, they controlled the scene. Now, they looked isolated, surrounded by the weight of what they had done publicly. One of the officers finally forced himself to speak. "Captain, we truly apologize." Captain Howard looked at him quietly for several long seconds before answering softly. "You apologized after hearing my title." Silence followed immediately. The rain continued falling around the station, while commuters listened carefully now. Captain Howard slowly looked around at the city workers saluting him moments earlier.
"What happens," he asked quietly, "to the people nobody recognizes?" The question hit harder than shouting ever could, because everyone standing there understood exactly what he meant. If nobody recognized him, the humiliation would have simply continued. Frank lowered his eyes briefly after hearing the question. Nearby station employees looked emotional now, while even the officers struggled to hold eye contact. Captain Howard glanced toward the crowded city streets beyond the station entrance. "Respect shouldn't depend on whether someone's famous, important, or powerful," he said softly. "It should already be there." Nobody on the platform could argue with him anymore. The rain finally began slowing as station workers escorted Captain Howard inside Central Station beneath the warm lights of the terminal. Passengers moved quietly out of his path, while employees continued greeting him respectfully as he walked through the station carrying the same worn duffel bag from earlier that night. The businessman from the bus stood silently near the entrance, watching the old veteran disappear deeper into the terminal, surrounded by people who clearly admired him. The two young officers remained outside near the platform, completely silent now beneath the fading police lights. Captain Howard paused briefly near the station doors before turning back one final time. "A uniform," he said calmly, looking toward the officers, "doesn't automatically create honor. Character does." Silence spread across the station entrance again. Then the elderly veteran turned quietly and continued walking through the terminal while transit workers respectfully moved beside him. The same man people treated like a burden moments earlier was now being honored by an entire station full of workers. And standing there in the cold rain, watching him disappear into the crowd, the officers were left with one painful realization. Sometimes the greatest people in a city are the ones the world stopped noticing long ago.